the last thing we need at this point is a war. A war will not unify the kind of society we have.
Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining me on GBN Originals. My guest for another illuminating conversation is Colonel Douglas MacGregor. I'm sure a familiar face and familiar voice for many of you. A former White House advisor and a sage and calm voice in the world of all things military and tactical. Colonel, it's lovely to see you again.
Good to see you as well, Neil.
We'll jump straight into it. There's so much happening at the moment. I would like, I think, first of all, to hear your perspective on President Donald Trump's recent announcements regarding Yemen and his battle with the Houthis, how you interpret what he's saying and what they are saying in reply.
Well, I haven't seen the document that may have been signed. I assume there was some sort of written agreement, something on paper. But it appears that we decided to tell them that if they did not attack our ships in the Gulf, in the Red Sea, that we would halt any further bombings of them. However, there were no strings attached to Israel. So as far as I understand it, the Houthis can continue to attack Israel or anything Israeli at will. This obviously has driven a wedge between Netanyahu and Trump. But I think President Trump was tired of watching the Navy fumble in the Red Sea. And admittedly, they've been out there for months and months and months. So I think he cut this deal to end what was increasingly embarrassing to us. Of course, he says the Houthis, quote unquote, surrendered. But I haven't seen any evidence for that.
Something that struck me right away was the possibility, let's say, given the broader picture of the posturing that the US has been making regarding Iran, even the possibility of conflict with China, ongoing conflict in Ukraine with Russia, that the apparent inability to significantly disable the Houthis undermines the credibility of a superpower. How can you continue to promise to take on every other superpower when a nation like Yemen and the Houthis are able to act with apparent impunity when it comes to continuing to attack and to launch missiles despite America throwing its might in their direction?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that statement. However, I would point out that I think an awful lot of credibility is gone anyway. President Trump made a number of statements before he was elected saying that he would end the war in Ukraine in a day, and subsequent statements that he would force President Putin and Zelensky to sit down together and this could all be ironed out. That failed pretty quickly. And then he said he was going to suspend aid to Ukraine and then suddenly reversed himself and continued it. I think we have at this point probably no credibility with the Russians at all. I think that President Putin has decided that he's erratic and that he's ultimately not in control, that other forces stronger than he are dictating activity and policy. So I think Ukraine is a wash as far as we're concerned. He could have gotten out of this very easily, as I said repeatedly for months. Recognize what you're dealing with in Kiev. It's a corrupt regime. It's a hateful regime. It's the source of the problem, not Moscow. But he saw it that way initially and now seems to be turning in another direction after he met with a pastor who went to Ukraine and spent a couple of days there and was allegedly shown evidence of Russian atrocities. And of course, we've been down that road several times. It always turned out to be wrong. If anything, the atrocities and the killings were Ukrainian. But it doesn't matter. He then used that as a justification to sign off on a new aid package. So I think Ukraine is just being fumbled badly. I don't know what the Europeans will do, but if I were a European right now and saw the kind of vacillation going on in Washington, I certainly would be very uncomfortable with it and uncomfortable with what appears to be an unstable government. Now, when you turn to the Middle East, it's equally interesting. Everyone who has had to do business historically with Mr. Netanyahu learns to hate him. He is sort of an arrogant sociopath and he's someone who demands and gives nothing. And I think President Trump grew tired of him and the way he was being treated by him. I don't think that ends the danger for a regional war by any means, for the simple reason that Mr. Netanyahu is determined to bring it on and can still do so whether or not President Trump necessarily likes it. President Trump recently said that he would have no objections to the development of a nuclear program in Saudi Arabia. And of course, that went down badly in Israel. And I think he's discovered that he's probably not going to be able to bully bully Iran into submission, because at the end of the day, Russia and China will both stand by Iran, as will other states. Again, this doesn't eliminate the potential for a regional war in the area, but I think it's caused him to step back, and suddenly we may end up with an agreement if we press ahead that is very similar to the one that we had under the previous administration, the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Agreement that was developed under the Obama administration with Iran. All of these things tell you how inconsistent, unstable, and erratic we really are. But the reason I keep saying there's still danger, major danger in the Middle East, is that Mr. Netanyahu has never had a better position. And he knows that if he precipitates the conflict in some way, there are a number of triggers out there. One could involve the plan to go into Gaza and butcher whatever remains of the population there, which the president of Egypt has said he will not tolerate. He will send in the Egyptian army finally. If that were to happen, I think you would then get a very rapid escalation, bringing in most of the region. Certainly, Iran is promised to stand by Egypt. And I think you would see Mr. Erdogan suddenly back off from his previous restraint and probably involve himself, because he clearly harbors ambitions of, quote unquote, liberating Jerusalem from the Zionists. So I don't think we're out of the woods by a long shot in the Middle East. And then there's something else, and this is this trade war. You know, tariffs are usually defensive in character. You impose a tariff because you're protecting an industry at home, either because it's new or because you don't want to lose the capability that industry provides. So we've used tariffs, everybody has in the past, to do that sort of thing. But he sort of blindly tariffed everyone in sight. Suddenly everyone in the world was treated as though they were the enemy. I think we're going to see more nations take the position. We've had it with, the bullying tactics. We've had it with the use of the SWIFT system, international institutions from Bretton Woods, to effectively bully and run the world financially from New York City and Washington. So I think he's being hurt on all of these angles very, very badly. We haven't even talked about domestic issues.
I hear what you say about Netanyahu and the position that he holds, but is it possible that Gaza has long since passed the point of being a stain, that whether or not Israel can ever erase it, that perhaps the US cannot? Plausible genocide, it's now moving into what appears to be the application of starvation. Is even the US, with its Congress so controlled by AIPAC, so that it feels like the Knesset makes the decisions rather than Congress, is it becoming a stain that even the US, as pro-Israel as it is, needs to wash its hands of sooner rather than later? And that while Israel might remain a focus for US support, that it can't be Israel under the Netanyahu iteration of the regime.
Have you ever seen a headline so biased you couldn't help but laugh? Well, here's how you can cut through the spin and get a clearer picture of what's actually happening out there. We've all seen those news stories. Everything's a catastrophe. Facts are feelings, and even the weather becomes political. If you're tired of wading through sensational headlines and narratives leaning so far left they're practically falling over, consider our partner Ground News. Ground News isn't just another news source, it's a tool that lets you easily spot the spin. Take, for example, the Trump tariffs pause. This story had over 600 articles, 29% on the left, 54% centre, and 17% on the right. Left-leaning coverage, like Bloomberg UK, framed the EU's tariff actions as a measured retaliation to Trump's policies, emphasising the need for predictable trade conditions and using terms like onslaught to describe Trump's approach. Right-leaning outlets, such as the Daily Express, conversely characterised the EU as bottling under pressure and engaging in revenge that the EU merely matched, and highlighting China's high tariffs on US goods. With ground news, you can quickly spot when a story is disproportionately covered from one side. They're handy bias ratings, which show purported news bias, and blind spot feed, a feed that you can see stories disproportionately covered by one side, make it easy to see what's being exaggerated, underreported, or simply misunderstood. What really convinced us to partner with Ground News is their commitment to transparency and clear information. In a time when algorithms feed us content designed only to hold our attention, not necessarily inform us, Ground News is genuinely refreshing. It's not about being unbiased, it's about clarity and balance. If you want to cut through sensationalism, visit ground.news/GBN or scan this QR code now to subscribe. You'll receive 40% off the Vantage plan, giving you unlimited ad-free access to news coverage worldwide.
Well, you and I may feel that way, but that's not the feeling in the United States, certainly not on the Hill, and I don't think that applies really in the White House. President Trump has pretty consistently failed to address what's going on in Gaza. You've got to remember that large numbers of billionaires who really constitute the backbone for AIPAC are responsible for putting him into the White House. Let's face it, that's what happened. Because they were able also to turn to others like themselves on the Democrat side and shut it down. In other words, shut down what happened in 2020. I think President Trump has to answer to them. I don't think he can just walk away from anything. But I don't see the willingness to tell the truth about Gaza. It's just not there. Now, could that happen in the future? Well, if we go into a financial crisis and it results in an economic collapse in this country, which I think we're headed into in some time in the next 3 to 6 months, then I think all things could change. But right now, I would say it's an impossibility. It's tragic, but that's the truth. And by the way, we don't get much help from other countries in the world either in terms of seeing truthfully what's going on in Gaza. Israel is a very powerful force, not because of itself and the 7 million people that live there. It's because of the diaspora that controls billions and billions of dollars, that has come into control of the financial system, the banking system, media, Hollywood, all of these things. They have an enormous amount of money and they have enormous veto power over anything the government tries to do that is antithetical to the interests of the Israeli state and, of course, themselves.
If it's impossible, for the reasons you outlined, for the Trump administration to get away from what's happening in Gaza, if they're just trapped as though in some sort of bear trap there, why not extricate themselves from Ukraine? All the time that he was campaigning, it was so credible when Trump said, "This is not my war. I don't want it. I didn't start it. If I had been there, it would never have happened. And if I get back into the White House, I'm going to stop it in a day." That was credible. Why has a situation evolved now where 100 days have passed and far from, peace, he's now starting to talk in terms of if Putin is not stopped, the tanks will roll into Poland and in the rest of Europe. Why not get himself out of one?
I think there are a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot of overlap between the people that would like us to destroy Iran for Israel and risk a regional war with everybody, the entire region that surrounds Israel, plus China, Russia, and others who may decide to come in. And there's the same people in many cases want to remain in Ukraine in perpetuity. BlackRock is a good example of that sort of thing. There are others that have now sunk resources into controlling Ukrainian farmland and agriculture, trying to control whatever mineral wealth they've got, which, quite frankly, is modest to none once you are west of the Dnieper River. So the overlap is there. You have some of the same people on both sides of this coin. And there's also Donald Trump. And I think the people that advise him and many people on the Hill that continue to see us in terms of great power status, superpower status that we occupied in 1991. They don't understand how profoundly the world has changed over 30 years. And they don't seem to want to believe it. That's why you hear disparaging remarks about countries from time to time from people. I've heard them make disparaging remarks about India, Pakistan, Iran, any number of countries, Russia, many East European states. There's a certain blend of arrogance and ignorance, Neil, that combines to distort people's views of the world. And then there is this narcissistic tendency, I think, with Donald Trump. And it's interesting because so much of what we do in this country in foreign and defense policy is really mortgaged to national vanity. And he's very much in that mode. He wants to always be seen as, quote unquote, the deal maker. And in his mind, that means that he's the one who has won the contest or imposed his will on others. Well, real estate is not a model for international relations. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. International relations is the art of the possible on the assumption that you want to end conflict. You want to save lives. And these were the things he said before he was elected. But then suddenly he's got advisors around him who say, boss, you really need a win on this one. How are you going to get a win? You can't get a win that way. You get a win by getting them to sign up to give you what you want. And so then you get into this bizarre mindset where President Trump, I think, truly believes that threats work. In other words, if you threaten people, they'll do what you want them to do. And, there's just not a lot of evidence for that sort of thing. You pointed to the Houthis. I mean, how much more can we threaten the Houthis? I don't know what else we can do, but what we've already done, and that has been an utter failure. So I think there are some people that have stood back and said, well, what would happen with Iran or what would happen with Russia and China and so forth? I think some people have tried to sober him up, but on the whole, he has a problem if he is not seen as the supreme being who arranged the outcome. That's a very serious problem. And then you have the delusion that I mentioned on the Hill and elsewhere. They think we are much more than we are. From the very beginning, when President Putin decided to finally intervene and remove what he thought was, and rightly so, a danger to his country, and this became then a much larger war, he was always very sensitive to the limits of his resources and also of Russia's interests. It's been made very clear over and over and over again. Russia has no interest in marching all the way 1,000 miles to Berlin. That's absurd. It's not interested. It's a waste of time, money, and resources. If you go back and look at the Warsaw Pact, look at Cuba and other countries that were de facto allies of the Soviet Union, they were a steady drain on the treasury. They were no benefit strategically to Russia. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn is the one that stood up and said, we should become a Russian state. Let's divorce, or not divorce, but divest ourselves from all of these people who are not Russians and are not Orthodox Christians like ourselves. We should focus on the core of what we are. President Putin is very aligned with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and I think President Putin both see Ukrainians, most of them, not all of them, certainly not those in the far west, but most of the rest, as Orthodox Christian Slavs. Now, there are many Ukrainians who will dispute that. They're largely in the West, not exclusively. But I think as a result, President Putin doesn't really want to move any further west than the Dnieper River. That's a historic limit, if you will, of Western penetration. Kiev, when it was in Polish-Lithuanian hands, was always the outpost of the West. Beyond Kiev, beyond the Dnieper River, you had Russians, Tartars, and Mongols. So I think President Putin is not interested in moving any further west. And at the same time, he has worked tirelessly to create good relations with all the Turkic Muslim peoples of Central Asia. And if you look at his relationship with Muslims, it's exceptional.
But whether he wants instinctively to move west of the Dnieper, is he not being shown that he can't really afford to leave a rump of Ukraine, which would just perpetuate the situation of having a very troublesome thorn in his side, open to exploitation by the US and NATO and others?
Well, he's also very patient in the sense that he knows that we are in a very fragile economic condition. People don't watch it, but I would urge everyone to watch the bond market. You call them gilts, from the German word Geld, for money. And if you look at the gilt crisis that occurred under Liz Truss, that's really what brought her down. That's going to come again in England. I think you're going to see that with Starmer's government. We are going to go through it on a grand scale. Each day we watch that 10-year Treasury bond, and we watch those interest rates go up. It's up to over 4.3%. As you get closer and closer to 4.5%, your national sovereign debt becomes unsustainable, and you collapse. That's where we're headed. Now, we've tried to stave it off in the past by printing money, but there are limits to how much money you can print. And I think we've long since breached those. And people keep insisting, well, you've got to lower interest rates. The problem is that we can't attract foreign investment into our country anymore. There's very little coming in. And without that foreign investment, particularly from China and Japan, Saudi Arabia, Great Britain, Germany, other countries, as that diminishes, our ability to sustain this sort of artificial standard of living which we have here is in jeopardy. We don't manufacture things anymore. I mean, you have this problem in Great Britain as well. If you ask, well, what do we have here in the United States from an economic standpoint that matters? And there are the 3 B's. Barrels, referring to energy, oil, and natural gas, which we've got enormous amounts of. And the second thing are bushels. In other words, agriculture. We still have an enormous agricultural agrarian sector. We can produce food in great quantities. And the third, of course, is bombs. We produce a lot of military equipment and munitions and cruise missiles and Patriot missiles and air defense missiles. So those are the 3 things that we actually manufacture at this point. That's not enough to sustain the country. High-end manufacturing used to exist in this country in the early 90s. It was all shipped overseas. People believe it's all coming back. Some of it will, a lot of it won't. A lot of it will move to other areas. People that have been in China are moving south now into Indonesia, Malaysia, and moving into India. So the assumption that suddenly everybody's going to come home is very misleading. And if we are going to repatriate high-end manufacturing, it's going to take decades. It's not going to happen quickly because the highly trained, educated workforce, skilled workforce that we historically have had really isn't there now. The workforce is not up to the task. And that, of course, is what the Taiwanese businessmen found when they went to Arizona and many other places, because President Trump said, come here and build the microcircuitry here. They said, we'd like to do that. Everything's very favorable, but the workforce. So we have serious problems, Neil, that everyone glosses over. We're also a very divided country. We're divided along racial lines. The racial hatred, particularly in the black community for white people and others, is stunning. We just had a young white boy who was in school, wanted to sit down at his place in I think it was in the gym or in the class, and this young black man stabbed him to death, just shoved a knife right into his chest and killed him on the spot. Well, right now, the black community is all in support of that black boy. They're raising hundreds of millions of dollars to defend him in court. This makes no sense. It's insane. Why would you celebrate such a thing? We just had a deputy police chief, retired, who was murdered by another black man in an automobile. And he was angry because the day before his son, who had a criminal record was shot by police. I mean, this is on a scale that I have not seen personally since the 1960s, early 70s. And it's not exclusively black-white. There are other serious problems in the country. How do you do anything under those circumstances externally? So the last thing we need at this point is a war. A war will not unify the kind of society we have. That's not how you build unity. We look more like Austria-Hungary today, let us say, than we looked like the United States back in the 20th century. So you put all this together. What do you do, Neil? I mean, he's riding. President Trump is in a in my judgment, very dangerous position.
You're certainly painting a picture of a house divided that cannot stand. I'd like to get some insight from you regarding what's been happening and is happening between India and Pakistan. You've mentioned economic realities that are staring the US in the face. I wonder what you think is happening in India and Pakistan, and if you think it has anything to do with the seemingly irresistible rise of BRICS. Mm-hmm. Because what that obviously represents is other countries, presumably tired of US hegemony, tired of being bullied, tired of the petrodollar being weaponized against them, finding ways in which to cooperate one with another and turn their backs on the US. And I wonder, do you think any of that is part of a connected picture? Do you think that what's happening between India and Pakistan is between those two powers, or is it being manipulated in that proxy fashion by others, scrabbling perhaps to undermine India in relation to the BRICS?
Well, we know that India and Pakistan, as well as Bangladesh to the east, have had differences in the past, and those differences have never gone away. And Kashmir is arguably an open wound that has never healed. So there's always an opportunity to create conflict in that area. There are people arguing that the CIA had a role in that, the Mossad, of course. I have no idea. One thing is certain, that I have listened to people on the inside celebrate damage to Pakistan from the standpoint of Chinese investment. Attacks, for instance, on the Karachi port, which has been modernized as a future terminal for the One Belt, One Road project, has been attacked and damaged by the Indians. And people were saying, well, that's great. By all means, keep it up. There's this unhealthy black-white view of the world that treats everyone who is not in agreement with you here as the enemy. It's a very stupid position to take, but I'm afraid it's more widespread here than anyone appreciates. So I think that there's no doubt that whatever can be done from the standpoint of the Trump administration to pull India out of BRICS is certainly something that they would welcome. And so they also want to trade on Chinese-Indian disagreements, conflict, and hostility. Thus far, whether you like any of the people in charge or not, I think both President Modi and President Xi are people that have exercised great restraint. And even now, in the midst of this tragic conflict, it's a low-intensity conflict in the sense that it has not become a full-blown war. I think Modi would also like to avoid a full-blown war. I see no evidence that the Pakistani leadership wants a full-blown war. Now, can they avoid it? There's a lot of emotion involved in this, as you know, Neil. But I think they both would like to avoid a war. To what extent we are encouraging one side or the other is anyone's guess. I am continually amazed by the dirty tricks masters over in the CIA and what they have achieved to promote conflict around the world from time to time. The Mossad is another feature. We're not looking much at it, but Baluchistan in southern Iran, which also includes a portion of Pakistan, the Baluchis have been trying to get out from under Persia for years. The Baluchis are warlike, and they're also a useful instrument for the Mossad that is trying always to destabilize Iran. There's evidence that some of this is linked to what's been going on between India and Pakistan. You're familiar with the Great Game, the notion that the British imperial policy and Russian imperial policy were always at odds in the Middle East and in Central Asia. I think there's some of that going on, but it's not even that sophisticated or well informed. It's ham-fisted and stupid, and frankly unnecessary for us to become involved in any way, shape, or form. If anything, we should simply urge the two parties not to fight. But I'm sure there are people that see benefit to a conflict there. I do not, but again, you've got to think like the people in Washington. And right now, everyone in Washington still thinks they're the center of the universe. They don't understand that we live in a world where nations like Russia, China, Iran are civilizational constructs. So to a large extent is Turkey. In other words, these are ancient people with ancient cultures and power that need to be seen in a different light from the one we see them. We don't seem to understand that, for instance, Iran has probably some of the finest engineers in the world right now. Their work in missiles and rocketry is astonishing. I mean, they are a force to be reckoned with. They're not some backwater, which is the big mistake that people in Washington make. They tend to view anything that is beyond the West as backward. It's not. And we're now shocked at the breakthroughs that the Chinese have managed with AI, and they manage it for a lot less money in a lot shorter time. Why are we amazed? None of these people are stupid. They're highly intelligent. They're very capable. And we ought to be interested in doing business with them and finding ways to work with them, develop positive relations. But instead of doing that, we're trying to find ways to harm what we consider to be unwelcome competition. And I think that probably sums it up. And I don't see that as having changed at all under President Trump.
It feels increasingly as though, without anyone noticing, it's the West that are becoming the barbarians at the gates of something else that has quietly and in its own way become sophisticated. You talk about the restraint that's been evident in the behaviour of Xi, Modi, Putin. They're so obviously, if you're right in all of that assessment, there's no way that they would be persuaded to change their course by yet more CIA/US proxy war troublemaking, in this instance, in the case of Kashmir. It's just more of the same. It's just the West becomes the barbaric enemy at the gate, while other people in their own ways are finding routes to cooperation, to entrepreneurship, to technological advance, to big picture thinking, and US and the West is still just throwing metaphorical bricks at windows.
I think you're onto something, but I would warn that this is not entirely new. It's new for us. We in the United States, until World War I, with the exception of the Spanish-American War, which frankly almost everybody regretted within a few years because we occupied the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and everyone within a few years said this has been a huge mistake. We should never have done this. And we spent probably 44 years out of 45 trying to find a way out of the Philippines. We just said this was a mistake. We're not an imperial power. We should never have done this. But Britain, on the other hand, spent a long, long time manipulating forces on the continent. One British government after the other sought to pit one set of forces against another to prevent any sort of coalition from arising on the continent or unifying forces on the continent, because they saw whatever changed in that matter as being a threat to them. Well, we've taken that mentality and that approach, and now we've applied it globally. And it's a serious mistake. But that's where we are. How do we get out of it? I think we get out of it through bankruptcy. Because remember, in 1947, when Great Britain decided to give India its independence, the debt to GDP ratio was 240%. And that was thanks to Churchill, who mortgaged the whole British Empire and his country to the United States in order to stay in this war with Germany. So, we've been down this road. You've been down this road. The Spanish Empire went down this road. I think we're getting closer with each passing day. So, for instance, we're now talking about $1 trillion defense budget. I don't think we're ever going to see it because I don't think we can afford it. And I think before the end of the year, we'll be cutting defense expenditures dramatically. And then we're going to have to look at all the entitlements, which no one really wants to address. But we'll have to, because we simply won't be able to spend as recklessly as we have in the past, because it will not be tolerated overseas. All this tariff war business and threats against other countries has simply made it almost impossible for us to look for any kind of understanding or support overseas, as it becomes increasingly clear that this debt is unsustainable. Normally what you want to do to your creditors is go to them and say, well, we'll cut here and cut here and cut here. And this will save this much, but we need your help as a bridge to get through this difficult time. Will you work with us? We did that, by the way, in 1932, again in 34 under FDR. We called it restructuring our debt. They were defaults. Richard Nixon, when he took us off the gold standard, that was effectively a default because Lyndon Johnson had broken the bank in Vietnam and at home simultaneously. It doesn't work. You cannot have everything, and you cannot do everything. And I think the demand increasingly inside this country will be for investment at home. I mean, what does $1 trillion buy you? Well, you spend roughly $250 million to $280 million on a new hospital. Well, how many hospitals could you buy for $1 trillion? And we need hospitals. Do you get my drift?
And for all our travails, or for all of the travails of the West, that so much of the rest of the world is just going another way. And for the first time, demonstrably doesn't seem to need or care about our travails.
Well, I think the rest of the world has really sort of turned its back on us and said, these people are lunatics. What are you doing in all of these places? Why are you, pushing a regional war? Look at the Greater Israel Project that Mr. Netanyahu briefed at the United Nations and has made public. They actually wear a patch on their uniforms now in the Israeli Defense Force that shows the new map. And suddenly Israel controls everything to Damascus, and Damascus presumably controls southern Lebanon, controls part of Jordan, controls the Sinai and part of Egypt on the other side in the Suez. And we're backing this? It's almost absurd. But that's what we're doing.
Colonel MacGregor, so often you put the fear of God in me when I listen to you, sir. But it's always illuminating. I always look forward to hearing where you are in your insights, and I always feel as if I've been educated. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Neil.